Hello.
I like how that's just become like the standard out on an island greeting for every episode. And it's like this very Mrs. Doubtfire-y kind of situation.
Yeah, it's great. It's very appropriate. I'm Al for people that don't know.
I'm Diz for people who don't know and do know. I'm still right. Diz. Yeah. Still currently Diz.
Congratulations.
You know, there's days where it doesn't feel like it at all, so I consider it an accomplishment.
Nice.
Yeah, episode 15. Did I say the right episode? We're on episode 15.
You did. Episode 15. You've been gone for a while. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I shared editing responsibilities with you. And can I just say that I also hate the sound of my own breath now?
Yeah, editing has been such an interesting process, like especially for anybody who doesn't know, we're using Audacity as our DAW, and it's kind of shitty. If anybody actually has any better recommendations for a DAW, we would love to hear about it. That, you know, isn't going to cost us an arm and a leg. I can see what ums and likes look like on like an audio wavelength now. Yeah. like visually see them.
I was like, why do I say so much?
Yeah, it's intense. It is pretty crazy. And just like the amount of thought in between words sometimes. Anyway, this is just podcasting complaints. If you ever want to start a podcast, that's what it's going to be like. We learned, so.
Yeah, very awesome. Land acknowledgement.
Oh,
we are on the stolen land of the Hawaiian Kingdom.
Yeah, we sure are. Annexed in 1893 illegally by the Dole Provisional Government, and still fucking up today.
Yep, our formal land acknowledgement can be seen on our website at outoninislandpodcast.com.
We can move into that personal update time. I am back. I'm back from all kinds of stuff. It's been a minute since we recorded.
Yeah, it's been crazy.
Yeah. Gold star to you for keeping episodes coming out and stuff while I was gone. For anybody who hasn't listened to past episodes, I was in the mainland for, I think, only like 10 days. I did San Diego, and then I was in Puerto Vallarta, and then I was in Seattle. And it was crazy, and it was fun, and it was all kinds of stuff, but it wasn't productive.
Sometimes having fun is all the productive that you need to do, though.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, like, if I want to talk about like achievement, like, yes, I definitely had a lot of fun, and I laughed my ass off, and I might have given myself a stomach virus via alcohol. So, yeah, it's all kinds of accomplishments in there. But it was really great, and I'm happy to be home. Fun fact, my partner contracted COVID while we were traveling, and I did not. So I don't know if that just means that I have really good immunity or if I'm just really lucky, but I'll take it either way.
Yeah, fuck yeah, that's awesome. That for you, not for your partner.
This is actually the first time that he's gotten it since it's been around. So, it caught up to him. He couldn't outrun it forever.
I still haven't had it, and neither has the mister. You had it though, right? Last year, the end of last year?
Yeah, I went to an Old Crow Medicine Show concert and got it because that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
How are you doing? How's everything going? You got big stuff coming up in your life.
I have so much big stuff coming up in my life. I think I have told almost everybody that needs to know one of the big things. The other big thing is that I have autism.
Oh, wow, dude. You got your diagnosis.
I do. We're going to go over the report in, I think it's 2 weeks. And so I took the tests. So I have autism, ADHD, dyslexia, and dyscalculia. And the mister was like, I can't imagine you having dyslexia. And like, so there's a lot of different types of dyslexia, and we're going to go over more the specific types that I have. But I do read slower on average than my peers. I love reading, but I just read slower. And then like dyscalculia totally makes sense because math is weird. I'm really good at it, but I'm bad at like tests, and I'm bad at writing stuff down. So calculators are amazing, especially for like doing what I do and like being able to work with programs and stuff. And the ADHD thing, the mister was like, I don't see that either. And like, it turns out therapy helped me mask like my ADHD tendencies, because I've learned in a lot of ways that like doing things that I would do when I interact with other people that are like ADHD things are not like okay. So like one of them is like, I used to like cut people off and finish what they were saying for them and then like move on, even if it wasn't what they were gonna say, you know?
Sure.
Yeah. So just like, I don't do that anymore because I learned that it's bad. So when I went through the ADHD one and she met with me about it, her name is Dr. Palmer and she's amazing. She was like, this isn't in alignment with what I imagined seeing. So can we talk through it? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, how did you answer some of these questions? And I was like, well, I answered them from like a today perspective, you know, like how I interact with people and things today. And she was like, oh yeah, let's talk about what it was like then before therapy and before, you know, like all these corrective things. And that's how that came out. It's kind of crazy.
Wow, dude. Well, I guess, you know, it's good to know. That's great. I mean, you know, you got some clarity. That's really great. And especially moving on into this like new chapter in your life, you can go into it with a little more clarity.
Yeah, I'm really excited about all of that clarity. So there's going to be like recommendations for me, and there's going to be letters for like HR and stuff. And like just having all that information is really good. And then like it kind of surprised me, like, oh, how far I made it. Cause like how far I've come like in my education, because like I succeeded with all of this shit. And is it just because nobody told me? I don't know if that's true, but like, it's just weird. Like you don't hear stories about people like succeeding. It's usually only stories about people failing.
Yeah. I mean, that probably says a lot about you as an individual. You know, you are a pretty incredible person. And, you know, I don't know that like, you know, like, I guess, is it like a drive thing? Because you just knew what you wanted to do. Like maybe some people just don't have that same kind of like trajectory. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes
like,
a lot of sense.
Failure seems a lot more abundant because there's no one particular goal in mind.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, either way that it worked out, you know, that's fucking cool, dude. That's cool that you got your diagnosis and you can start, you know, building from that foundation. Do you want to shout out that organization one more time for anybody who might not have heard our past episode?
Yeah, so it's GRASP, and that stands for the Global and Regional Autism Spectrum Partnership. And they're amazing. They do different assessments, and they have like a group chat that you can participate in. And when they have more people on staff, you can also get career coaching. And it's a really awesome community that I'm excited to be a part of. One thing too is that I saw a meme that really like, I'm not sure. I think a friend sent it to me and it said, don't feel bad for me because I have autism. Know that I'm happy that I don't wake up hating myself every day. Or like, you know, because like you don't understand like, oh, why is this so hard? Why don't I understand things like everybody else understands them, like in a lot of ways. So it just is really nice to be like, to have a reason like, oh, okay. My brain really does process things differently, and that's okay. And I don't have to hate myself for it or wonder what's wrong.
Yeah, I think that is the hardest part about it, is just like this constant downward spiral of like, what is wrong with me? You know, especially when your like everyday life is so heavily involved in social activity. Like, you're a professor, obviously socialization is a big part of what you do. You know, I mean, I guess even just being in any workforce, like social interactions and stuff are just going to be a giant part of what you do. So like, it's good to learn how to navigate that from like a fundamental perspective instead of just being like, I'm so weird, you know, because that's how I feel all the time.
Yeah. Oh, well, I hope that you take comfort in, I know that you weren't going through with a formal assessment, but just in understanding that, like, you know, you are special and you don't have to hate yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I should pursue a formal assessment. I'm just lazy. I'm always like, $300, but I want to go to New Zealand. You know what I mean? A dick. Anyway, moving on. That's fucking great, by the way. That's really cool, and I'm very happy for you. Moving on, you got any current events you want to talk about? What's going on in the world? Nothing good?
I mean, nothing good is going on in the world, and I have a thing for sweet, sweet justice. And there is, like, local politics wise, there's been some more sweet, sweet justice doled out. There's this whole ring of lawmakers and stuff that got caught for like taking bribes, and they have been like sentenced to prison, and like it just feels so good because these people are supposed to like have our best interests in mind and not be like making decisions for if it's for the council or like Maui County or Hawaii County or like the judicial system. You know, they shouldn't be taking bribes in order to have specific outcomes. They should be like thinking of our best interests and like,
yeah,
like fuck them. So it's just been so nice to watch like one after another these dominoes fall with these people going to prison.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the world, right? The world's so crazy. Like, I had this really interesting. So when I was in Seattle on this last trip, well, when I was in Mexico, Roe v. Wade was overturned, which is like, fuck, you know?
Right.
And then the very next day, I was in Seattle and it was Pride weekend, you know? So it was this like really insane contrast of just like this really gross authoritarian, just like really fascist feeling vibe in the air with Roe v. Wade being overturned and like all of this bullshit. And then it was a really nice contrast to stand in the middle of Seattle, you know, with thousands of people celebrating Pride. And I felt like that was a really good, like, visceral metaphor for what the world is like right now, or at least the United States is like, you know?
Yeah.
Like, you hear all of this shit. There's always all this negative bullshit flying at you, especially because our media outlets are just such garbage. But then, like, you get glimpses of, like, some good news, too. And it's been really hard to remember the good news. I mean, especially with, like, the fucking Highland Park shooting now, you know what I mean? Like, how many more fucking shootings are we going to have, like, in the course of, like, 3 months? Or, like, what the fuck is going on there? If anything, all that I can hope for is that it's just going to continue to widen the conversation about gun regulations. You know what I mean? And that's like the most justice that can be done for those lives that are being lost. But, you know, it really sucks to watch the news now. For anybody who is going through that, like, news phobia, I guess try to remember that there is still really great things happening in the world.
Yeah, we didn't make it down to Pride this year because I started a new like training cohort program, and so we missed Pride. We actually went downtown, but we missed Pride. I'm bi, so Pride is something that's kind of important in our house. Having Pride is important in our house, and it did get overshadowed this year by the Roe v. Wade thing. Again, this is like my huge area of activism is just women's right to choice and bodily autonomy. I've been having conversations with people about bodily autonomy. I've been trying to help people like remove their personal information from period tracking apps, and like some of it is real easy, you know, some of it is not. Like you can delete your profile, and for some businesses that's enough for them to not access it, but some companies don't have a policy in place where you can request your data to be removed. Yeah, and that's kind of problematic.
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
That's fucking gnarly, dude.
Yeah, that's the very first thing that I like put out there. Like, okay, if you are in these states, you know, you got to be wary of this. And then like another thing that's coming up is that some like heart medications may induce miscarriage. And so those medications can't be prescribed to women because it might cause them to, what are they calling a miscarriage now? Yeah. So even if there's no chance of them being pregnant, if they are in specific states, they cannot take specific heart medications.
This is such fucking garbage bullshit. Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's fucking crazy.
It's the worst. It's so bad. And like, I just have a couple more things to say about it. So like, because this is my area of activism, I'm like, really like, I need to do something. So I put in an application with an organization that helps get women access to abortion. It's not that one that we previously talked about on here, which is the Brigade Alliance. It is a different organization. And I put in an application to volunteer to clean data. And I'm really hoping that I get it. And I hope, you know, if you feel called to do something, you actually like, if you need help actualizing that feeling, then, you know, you can always reach out. I can connect you with organizations in your area or like different places where, you know, you can put, you know, your time and your interest so that you can contribute to like this cause or any cause. If you are interested in doing something, I can help connect you with information so that you can move toward actualizing on that thing.
Awesome, dude. That's really cool. It's a lot to take.
I know. I totally forgot. I totally forgot about like that we haven't recorded an episode since Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, it was the general mood, I think, like I said, I was in Mexico when it happened, but like the general mood in returning to the United States was pretty crazy. We had a couple people reach out to us on our Instagram just to be like, what the fuck, right? Which was like, yeah, dude, for sure. So it was nice to get some like camaraderie, just to know that, you know, there's a lot of outrage about it. And like, this is the time to fucking rage about it. Like, don't go quietly into this good night. It's 2022, you know, like I keep trying to tell myself like that this is the death rattle of like a very, very backward generation, you know, and they're just grasping at straws, and we're just going to see a lot of like, you know, the candle flickering violently before it burns out. And I like to think that that's what this is, because the generations coming up are, you know, like things like Pride are so well accepted now. And that's not everywhere, but like a vast majority of the country, I think, you know, would prefer to live in a nicer world. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. We did mention on one of our last episodes that we're going to start adding in some good news along with this really hard to swallow bullshit. So I have a good news update. According to an article by Victoria Prester on the Good News Hub, the first solar-powered electric car is going to be released this year. And that's pretty sick. Yeah, it's going to be very expensive, but, you know, the great thing about that is that means that the industry is there. And this technology will start to become more commonplace. Yeah, which is really fucking nice, you know, because even the idea of electric vehicles is really precarious. We can't really stand to like make all of these charging stations, and then even so, it's like, what is the cost of generating that power, right? So We have solar power technology coming to the automotive industry, and if you are like us and live in a place where driving is a necessity, this is a really, really big deal. It's pretty cool. It's going to be called the Lightyear Zero. It has a 388-mile range and generates 44 miles of that completely from solar. Very cool.
That is super cool. That's really amazing.
So there's some good news to just wash down all of that bad news. Cool. Do you want to talk about what we're talking about today?
Sure. So today we're going to talk about like punk, I guess, versus metal, but I don't really feel like it's a versus thing. I feel like they really like coalesce nicely. I don't know. They like work together. They complement each other. They're like siblings, you know, sometimes they hate each other and sometimes they're friends. I have no siblings, so I don't know if this is accurate, but yeah. What do you think?
Siblings. About my siblings? No, they're great. I think this conversation actually stems from an earlier episode. If you guys have been following along with our episodes, I don't remember exactly which episode it was, but we kind of spurred the conversation about like punk and metal and like which one came first and which one influenced, you know, the other. And that inspired a really kind of like rabbit hole conversation to happen, and that is like Alicia actually even said in the episode, we're going to talk about this later. So this is us talking about it later. I posed the question in that episode, you know, if punk rock was first on like a chronological order of like music history. I have now seen that that's not necessarily true. But I think, you know, it's a discussion worth having here. I've had really in-depth conversations with this subject, like regarding this subject with a few people now, and it's amazing how deep this topic gets. So in your brain, where does metal begin?
Well, my brain is not reality. I mean, okay, so the first thing I go to is definitely like progressive rock. And then the very first metal band that came to mind when you asked that question is Black Sabbath. But I know intellectually that like both punk and metal have their roots in like the 1950s and then all the way back to like what is her name? Sister DeCoin, who played the guitar real bluesy like in the 1800s. You know, like they all have history in like American
I think that
rock.
That's just music in general. And then, if you're going to start splitting hairs like that, like you can talk about how like no rock and roll would exist without like the creation of like the dreadnought guitar, which wouldn't have been created without Hawaiian music, which wouldn't have, you know, so like that gets a little intense. I think let's start with like the 60s though. And like the birth of not only like heavy metal, but I think so this is where the conversation really started getting interesting when you think about like the birth of heavy metal, because I don't think that the Rolling Stones get enough credibility for inventing the like kind of aesthetic around metal that Led Zeppelin adopted and Black Sabbath adopted, that kind of started creating like what the fundamental like culture of heavy metal was going to be. And I say that because the Rolling Stones, as far as I know, were the first mainstream band to start putting out like satanic, like, I don't want to say ethos, but like, I guess acknowledgement in their music. Like you have Sympathy for the Devil, which I think kind of really flew under the radar in the mainstream because it sounds like a blues song, like because, you know, Rolling Stones are a blues rock band. Not to mention they had that album, Their Satanic Majesty's Request was a album released in 1967. So this is actually the year before bands like Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath started stepping onto the scene. And yeah, like I said, the Rolling Stones like definitely have the mythos behind them about, you know, they sold their souls and all of that stuff. And looking at Keith Richards right now, that's probably fucking true, because how the fuck is that guy still alive? If I'm gonna say, like, I don't want to say heavy metal started at the Rolling Stones, but I'm gonna say the culture started there. That was like the seed.
I think I can agree with that, because also considered in that same like proto metal category for some reason is Jimi Hendrix, but I don't associate him necessarily with metal. I guess I can see it, but it's more like acid rock, I would think.
Yeah, I think like that 60s psychedelic rock was definitely like, you know, I think metal was like a next logical step from there, especially in terms of technicality. But like, I wouldn't say that Jimi Hendrix, you know, was doing anything beyond like LSD. You know, obviously the man is the greatest guitar player who ever lived. That's not up for dispute. But like, I think his inspiration was less like rooted in any particular kind of like occult aesthetic, like the Rolling Stones were, and then definitely Led Zeppelin, and then absolutely Black Sabbath, you know?
Right.
And I think
I'm sorry. Ahead. I was just going to ask, do you like this era of metal? This satanic metal thing?
Are we talking about this era of rock and roll, like the 60s, like kind of like Led Zeppelin and that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
Fuck yeah, I do. Absolutely, I do. So I like it for two reasons. And one of those reasons is that it was, you know, all of these bands, Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, even Black Sabbath, like it's all derivative of blues, right? And so I love the blues. I love rock and roll. Putting them together is logically going to be good music. Led Zeppelin ripped off every single one of their songs from blues artists that came before them. They just did it really well. And Jimmy Page is a fucking incredible guitar player, you know? Mm-hmm. So like, it's kind of hard not to like them. But I do like, you know, and I also like anything that kind of fucks with that like occult side of music, like, you know, doom metal. I really like doom metal a lot, particularly like 80s doom metal, like Pentagram and stuff. But how do you feel about it? You have a adverse opinion to that?
Can appreciate like the musicality and artistry behind it, but like it's never been something that interests me so much. I think because I did like the era that came right before the proto psychedelic rock stuff. And then I like Deep Purple and the progressive side of things, and that whole, you know, actual, those bands, Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin. I mean, like, I didn't even listen to Stairway to Heaven all the way through until after the Mister and I moved back here.
Yeah, well, I can't say I blame you for that. Of all of their songs, that's got to be the worst one.
And honestly, Mary J. Blige's cover of it is just like amazing. I feel like it gave people a great place to like run from there, you know, with it and really do different things with it. I like her version the best. But no, and you said doom metal, and doom metal is one of the genres of metal I absolutely cannot stand. It makes me want to crawl out of my skin. It goes so slow. I'm like, what is this?
I could see that. You know, I mean, if you don't do drugs, like smoke pot, especially, which like I don't, but I did for a long time. You know what I mean?
Too, and it was still just like, I'm crawling out of my skin.
Yeah, well, there you go. It's not for everybody.
It is not.
But I will say that, like, so I think that's the fundamental beginning of heavy metal, is just about right there in that sweet spot, 68, 69, which I would also say that the birth of punk rock happened with the Stooges. Everybody has this big debate on where punk rock started, and 1977 always seems to be the year that everybody accredits for the birth of punk rock. But I don't think that you can listen to the Stooges' self-titled album and call it anything other than punk rock. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's called the Stooges, but the first song on it is 1969. So
yeah, totally. That song, or like, you know, so many of the Stooges songs have been endlessly covered by punk bands. I mean, and I would argue that, you know, David Bowie as well was something that was definitely what punk rock would, crawl out of culturally, especially, with like the clothes and like gender bending and like that kind of stuff. So
yeah,
I think they both happen simultaneously in the late 60s. And then it's kind of interesting though, because from there, like heavy metal kind of goes in like a glam rock kind of direction from there, where like punk rock became like that, UK invasion, or I guess like Ramones kind of like idea of punk rock in the 70s. Because what was, let's look at 70s metal and see who we're accrediting.
Early 70s is different from late 70s. So Judas Priest is late 70s. There's like, if we look at like just like before, well, I don't even know if they're glam rock. They're just really prevalent for, what metal, not even maybe mainstream metal became.
Priest?
They kind of, Judas Priest.
Yeah. I mean, they're speed metal, dude, and like, so this is what I was going to talk about here. This is like one part of the conversation that I had that got really interesting. So what happens in the 70s is pretty fascinating on this topic, because you do have, so like the glam rock industry kind of starts here. You get bands like Kiss coming out in the 70s. You get bands like Montrose and fucking Aerosmith, shit like that. And that's like kind of heavy metal for the 70s. And then also in the 70s, like roughly around 76, that's when you start to see bands arise from the punk rock scene. Like the Sex Pistols are really big at that time. And even in like the UK, there's some anarcho bands rising, like Crass and stuff. So like, and that's kind of like the mid 70s. And then by the late 70s, you have this big convergence of punk rock and metal, where I don't think that like heavier versions of metal would have existed or like would have swayed away from that glam rock identity if it hadn't been for like the birth of punk rock and like hardcore punk rock. You know what I mean? Because
real.
I think that Motorhead, famously accredited as a metal band, would not have gotten to where they were without the birth of punk rock. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and a lot of metal bands actually are attributed to like borrowing their style from punk. So you're right. It's like entire movements of metal that wouldn't exist, and like some of those include, like we talked about, speed metal, but then also thrash metal, which is like,
for sure.
Yeah. So when I learned about thrash metal, which also wasn't until later in life, I was like, oh my gosh, this is why I love punk rock, because like, it's like the same. It's like hardcore punk. It's 80s hardcore punk kind of,
Totally.
And then even crust punk is accredited to as a metal genre, but it's crust punk. So that's weird. I mean, I know we're not there yet in the timeline, but
60s into the 70s, like metal kind of takes a dive into like this like very like flamboyant kind of just its own culture, especially with bands like Van Halen and stuff like that. That's where metal's headed. And then punk rock happens. And all of a sudden out of that come the 80s and like this like sudden
new wave British metal, new wave British heavy metal.
In the 80s or in the late 70s. Yeah.
In the 80s.
Yeah, and that's when you start getting like all of those bands like Motorhead, and you're getting like bands like fucking
Iron Maiden is another one.
Fuck Maiden for sure. Basically every fucking metal band that you've ever thought about in terms of like classic metal, they're definitely the biggest wave of heavy metal.
But it wouldn't, so it's said that like this especially wouldn't have existed without punk rock.
Yeah, I think what it did, that's why, is kind of it took the glam away, because I mean that even kind of was happening with like punk rock to an extent, especially with like the birth of the Sex Pistols and stuff, because anytime you have a fashion movement, then like it's going to be like, you're going to get kind of like a watered down version of this thing. So like the New York Dolls, right? Like that, Johnny Thunders, all of that was kind of like this very like silly kind of toothless version of what the Sex Pistols were doing. And I think that's kind of like what Aerosmith was to like what Black Sabbath was doing. You know what I mean? And so all of a sudden punk rock comes out with this like a very raw culture, though, especially as like punk starts to get more hardcore with bands like the Dead Kennedys forming in like the late 70s and the Misfits. And I don't think without that birth of like American punk rock, the British birth of like heavy metal would have happened.
Yeah, this is also, we got a lot of female fronted punk bands too, like in the late 70s that also kind of help influence metal. So we had Siouxsie and the Banshees, the Runaways, and Blondie, like all doing big things like in punk rock. And I think maybe it's still like there still wasn't a lot of women in metal at the time, I don't feel like, but there was a lot of like in glam, they played a lot with like gender presentation, but there still wasn't a lot of like women, I feel like, in metal at the time.
Yeah, definitely not. I mean, I don't know if it's just because like at the same time when like metal was kind of in that phase of creation, because like it was definitely a boys' game, but it was also very aggressive as like a scene. Like you're talking about like the early surge of metal or like heavy metal in the 80s that came out of like these punk rock influences were bands like Metallica. You know, I think that like that was it was very technical and it was very aggressive and it was very, what's the word I'm looking for? It was just really masculine, you know, and that's coming out of like that same, I think at the time, what women in punk rock were doing was not what like men in punk rock were doing. And those bands that were listening to those male-fronted punk bands that like gave birth to like this British heavy metal were probably not interested in hearing what like Siouxsie and the Banshees were doing, you know, because like, yeah, especially like Blondie is very poppy and I actually can't even stand listening to Blondie.
No, I think Blondie is more pop than punk. Yeah. But at the same time, the metal, this is like, so at this crucial time period too, like we're starting to get a lot of fantasy metal, which isn't even like its own genre at this point. Like by now, fantasy metal and folk metal in 2022 is like, these are enormous subgenres. But like at the time in the 80s, like people were just exploring with like singing about fantasy and like mythology and like turning myths and lore into metal music. So same but different. They're like, we can't listen to what those girls are doing, but let's go sing about like fairies.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that like fantasy, like metal kind of stuff started with like Led Zeppelin and anybody who was like particularly obsessed with the occult. Led Zeppelin was very, very like upfront about their like Lord of the Rings nerdiness, you know what I mean? I think like one of their songs like straight up just has like lyrics that were taken straight out of The Hobbit.
That's cool.
I mean, like, you know, they were really into that like Aleister Crowley black magic kind of thing. And I mean, for sure, like Crowley's influence was huge on like that whole D&D culture, you know what I mean? Like, and like Lovecraftian kind of things. And like, I don't think like without the existence of like those historical figures that like fantasy metal would even exist at all, or definitely not the way that we know it. Like when was the Satanic Bible released? That was released in 1969. Yeah, so that makes sense. You know, like, so I think the late 60s that like fantasy metal culture was definitely brewing. I'm sure that there's like some fantasy metal bands throughout the 70s that nobody's ever heard of.
Probably. Okay, so we are in the 80s now.
We are in the 80s now. And I would say, like, you know, in the 80s, you start getting American bands like Rainbow and, like, you know, the rise of, like, Dio.
Yep. Yay, Rainbow.
That's like what's happening in the United States, along with like all of these like British metal bands that are coming in.
Yeah, we also get one of my favorite, it should be its own fucking genre, I swear, is 80s metal hair ballads. And it's not its own genre, but like this is like, I don't even consider those bands like really like thrash bands. Like those are hair metal bands. But so like Poison, Motley Crue, RATT, which I don't really like, but I worked with someone whose favorite band was RATT. And I was like,
oh, that's intense.
It was weird. And I was like, I thought you were cool till like 2 minutes ago. And then on the other side of that, you have, so those are like the hair metal, right? And then on the other side of that, at the same time, you're getting like the evolution of Metallica. You're getting Megadeth and Testament. You're getting Slayer, and like you're getting just these like totally different like bifurcations and more bifurcations of metal in the mid 80s.
And the technicality is starting to get insane, like especially with like the emergence of like bands like, I don't know, fucking Pantera, like people started down tuning, people started like creating the sound that like is modern day metal. And like especially like Slayer, like you had this like really like that was like the foundation that like sealed what heavy metal music was, I think, in like at least in like the world's like mainstream idea. It was like this very intense like, oh, there's pentagrams and there's fucking Satan and all of this like really heavy guitars and really fast drums and like all of these things that like have just defined metal for the world. That is kind of interesting because it took like a complete divergence from punk rock in the 80s, where American hardcore became, I feel like, less about the technicality in music, because there wasn't a whole lot of technicality in American hardcore bands. It was more just about being like as fast and raw as you could be, I feel like, in the 80s. And it was absolutely carried by like young people at that point. Like a lot of the bands who were really famous in the 80s in American hardcore, like teenagers, So that's really interesting, like how those two or like genres took like a diversion from each other again in the 80s and kind of stayed that way, I think. Well, you know what? That's not true. There were a couple bands, like, I don't know if you've ever heard of English Dogs. English Dogs is a really great band that kind of straddles that line between punk rock and speed metal. And they formed in 1981. So, like, that, I think, was maybe the first, I don't want to call them the first, like, thrash metal band, but they're pretty fucking close. If you've never heard them before, I highly recommend English Dogs. I've liked them for a really long time, and I just put them on for my partner the other day, and they're still good. Still like them. Nice. They're also some like dorky ass fantasy metal shit sometimes too.
Well, I always have room for fantasy metal, actually. And symphonic metal is just right up there. We're not there yet, like as far as an evolution, but
yeah, I highly recommend checking out English Dogs then. Anyway, so then they kind of like take a little diversion from each other in the 80s, and then the early 90s is, I think, when like they butt heads again. And I mean, in between that too, like I guess in the late 80s, especially in like big metropolitan cities like LA, there was like a war between punk and metal. And I actually pulled up this article that we'll post in the show notes. It's from loudersound.com, and it's called Punk versus Metal, the Battle of Los Angeles. It's essentially just talking about how in the early 80s into like the late 80s, especially with like the comeuppance of like fucking hair metal, how different those two genres became and how brutally the hate was between each other. And like that makes sense. It makes sense. One got very flamboyant and one got very almost like toxically masculine, Not to say that like all 80s punk rock was like that, but like definitely that scene, I think, was, it definitely made room for some tough guy bullshit.
Yeah.
So I could see how like you would want to beat up like people listening to Poison. I still kind of do.
But those ballads, though, no, just
it's so wild to fucking. It's so wild to listen to those songs. Or like, what's even more wild is to see those people in 2022. Like, we just saw Vince Neil on a show the other day.
Oh.
For anyone who doesn't know, Vince Neil is the lead singer of Motley Crue.
How much plastic surgery did he have?
If he did have some, it was hidden under lots and lots of fat. So
okay, he got fat.
He's fat as shit, yeah.
There's like 3 ways that they went. They got fat, they got plastic surgery, or they got like real strung out, and like none of them are pretty,
Yeah. I mean, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a self-fulfilling prophecy of like destruction. Because that lifestyle is, not sustainable, and it does not allow for like growing up. And I guess you could argue that about punk rock too, if like the punk rock in itself wasn't intelligent, So like but it is like definitely that party boy, like Motley Crue's whole like ethos of like girls and stuff. Like, yeah, of course you're gonna end up like fat as shit and like a creepy dude, Like,
yeah.
How big is your window to be that guy? Like 10 years before like you're just gross? Like,
unless you have amazing genetics, like.
yeah. I guess like Dave Navarro is kind of like one of those dudes who like skirted getting fat.
He is so beautiful.
Do you think so?
Do I think Dave Navarro is fucking beautiful with his pointy eyebrows that like he hasn't aged since like, yes, Dave Navarro is so beautiful. Oh, we talk about Dave Navarro all the time in this house. Dave Navarro is a fine gentleman. And he's nice, and he cares about mental health, and he, supports women in the arts. And like, I don't know, Dave Navarro, he's like 50 something, I feel like, and like looks so good.
I honestly don't know anything about Dave Navarro. So other than like that, he still, is very much into like his tight leather pants and stuff. But yeah, my point is that lifestyle was never sustainable. So like those guys were fucking doomed from the start. If you were super committed to like your destructive punk ethos at that point, like you were probably just gonna die, and that was like where you were headed, like that live fast, die young mentality. But for those guys, like they got really fucking rich, and they just got like really fucking fat. And what was really interesting about seeing Vince Neil on TV the other day was like he was like on some we were watching some fucking like celebrity wife swap like bullshit or somewhere. It was funny. Anyway, fun. And like the entire time that I was watching it, like I turned to my partner and I just looked at him and I was like, he killed a guy. You know what I mean? Like he killed a guy, and like this is what he's doing now. Like he skirted jail and all of his consequences because he was like a big fucking rock star, and now this motherfucker's sitting pretty doing some B-list celebrity show, and like this is just his life. But like let's all remember that like Vince Neil killed a guy, okay? Let's not excuse him from that. Like
no,
the world has. But yeah, so anyway, let's talk about the 90s, because that's really my favorite like era of punk rock, and I feel like that era of punk rock doesn't exist without heavy metal.
I agree with you. And then we can talk about where does grunge fit, because grunge can be its own thing. Some people consider grunge a subset of punk, and then some people consider grunge a subset of metal.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Nirvana definitely considered themselves punk rock.
They were punk as fuck.
Yeah, but I mean, arguably the grungiest grunge band that ever grunged. So
yeah, them, yeah.
Yeah. So like I think that if they're going to come from one side or the other, they're probably punk rock. I also just stylistically, I think that they would be more from like the punk rock realm. And I don't know if that's just because they weren't that good at the guitar or what, but I would definitely say that grunge probably fits more on like the punk rock end of the spectrum. But
yeah, I don't know, because there's way more like grunge metal bands like Soundgarden and Pearl Jam, and who else came out of there? Alice in Chains. Like,
yeah, I would say that those bands definitely, but I would also argue that none of those bands sound anything like Nirvana.
Yes, they don't. I agree 100%. Yeah. And I actually don't consider them like grunge, but people do.
Yeah, I mean, I think they probably evolved from that grunge scene. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's probably like the next progressive step, like, especially on a mainstream context. But like, I don't think that Alice in Chains sounds anything like Nirvana other than the fact that, the music's about heroin.
Mm-hmm. So why is this your favorite era of punk?
This is my favorite era of punk because this is when it's like the punk rock subculture woke the fuck up and realized that they could be good at their instruments and still be punk rock, Yeah. So then the early 90s saw the birth of crust punk, which is like melodic hardcore crust punk music, which definitely has all of its roots in speed metal and thrash metal and punk rock. So now you get bands like Nausea. Excellent fucking band. They are much more refined, like in their sound. There's, the songs aren't 2 minutes long and just blah, 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 and it really was a huge like turnover from American hardcore. So that was like the finest era of punk rock, or like the beginning of the finest era of punk rock for me, was just like, because I feel like as somebody who appreciates music, like I always will love what punk rock was at its roots. But like, as somebody who like plays music and like wants to learn more about music, like it's really hard to sit there and just listen to the same 3-chord songs all the time. And so like crust punk and, bands like that, like politically, I feel like they have a better message. The lyrics are a lot more intelligent than a lot of what was happening in like the 80s hardcore scene. Not all of it, because that's definitely not accurate. There's very intelligent music coming out of the 80s hardcore scene as well, but it was set to just better music,
Yeah, I 100% agree with your statement that it is the beginning of the best era of punk rock. Yeah. Because, it's cool to respect everything that came before. And in some ways you have to, but like there is so much more that has happened when people learn to play an instrument. Like,
yeah, and like really broke that like bullshit ideology about punk rock that it had to be 3 chords, you know what I mean? Because like there's only so much that you can fucking do with 3 chords, and like that makes every band sound exactly the fucking same. Yeah. And there's definitely a lot of crust punk bands, especially now, that are very formulaic in making punk or crust punk, and so like there's a lot of bands that sound the same for sure. But like holy shit, all of a sudden, oh fuck, we have to talk about Discharge. I can't believe we didn't talk about Discharge. I'm an idiot. Discharge and the invention of D-beat. That is something we're gonna backtrack on, because Discharge formed in 1977, and Discharge was the birth of thrash punk. And I'm an idiot for not talking about this earlier. D-beat was so essential to what would later become crust punk, and that is such a huge fundamental step in punk rock that was not appreciated at the time that it was happening, I think, and didn't really get its due diligence until the 90s, I feel like. But then the really fascinating thing to see out of like the 90s American crust scene was like how that spread around the world to like, fuck, Japanese crust punk is so good, and like there's a bunch of bands from Mexico that are so fucking good, and like it just there's so many good 90s crust punk bands, it's insane. Yeah, and then I don't really know what happened in the 90s with metal because I generally hate most music from the 90s. Which is funny because it's like my favorite era of punk rock, but it's like my least favorite era of anything else. So do you know what was going on with metal in the 90s?
I know a little bit about what was going on with metal in the 90s. So the 90s and the birth of grunge were kind of like the downfall of popular mainstream metal. So grunge kind of like took over, which is why it's weird when sometimes it's like situated in fucking metal, because it's like, what, I don't understand. Metal was just kind of like stewing. It was this weird hodgepodge where like these older bands, you know, were trying to like conform to the new style of metal. Like there was really, it was a period of like death in some ways. There wasn't really a whole lot going on in metal until the 2000s. So it was like this period of like death and then like prototyping new shit and like how can we amalgamize, you know, aside from like, you know, the Seattle metal bands that I previously mentioned, like there wasn't a whole lot of noticeable. And then also in there too, like Pantera, like Dimebag Darrell died, you know, so like that was like a big blow.
Sure. I feel like metal kind of started taking a different turn in the 90s too, towards like more of what you were going to see in the early 2000s in terms of popularity, like bands like Tool, you know, that definitely was big in the 90s. And like that's like prog metal, but like I think they would fit
industrial.
In, like, industrial. Yeah, the birth of industrial music, I guess, happened in the 90s, really. And that's like a really...
Yeah, those are Rammstein, KMFDM, Nine Inch Nails, and Marilyn Manson. So that's kind of what metal was doing, which is like a blend of glam.
Yeah, which is... It was kind of just taking this more... what is the word? A more like satanic approach to like glam rock, I guess, is what that's definitely like how I would describe Marilyn Manson. It's like the music's just as shitty, but like it's just a lot more shocking, you know? Shock rock. It was like shocky, cocky rock. But like you also got like the emergence of bands like System of a Down and like Rage Against the Machine like started kind of making what would be like rap metal, which like
turns into new metal.
Yeah,
so they're actually classified as funk metal, which I wouldn't have thought of. We had this debate too. Like I was like, no, they are punk, and you're like, no, they are metal, and they are classified as metal. But like when they came out, it was like. It was so not metal that it was punk. I felt
I have a hard time with that. I feel like, honestly, like with Rage, I think that their attitude and like their political awareness was very punk. You know what I mean? Like, but I would really, really, really struggle to call like their whole like sound punk rock, and I would really struggle to call their aesthetic punk rock. They were very like, I don't know, this is when metal really starts to suck for me. And I like metal, don't get me wrong, but like the 90s was like my favorite era of punk and like the worst fucking era for metal. Like,
agreed.
And that's including hair metal in the 80s, because like I would rather listen to fucking RATT than listen to fucking System of a Down. You know what I mean? Like the 90s, like mid to late 90s, started to give birth to like a bunch of really weird, shitty things like Linkin Park. You know what I mean? Like, I don't fucking listen to that.
New metal is fine. I mean, it's whatever, it's preference. So I guess then we should just jump right to the 2000s, because we're already talking about new metal, which is like the big thing. But then there's all this other stuff that emerged out of like the late 90s, early 2000s and stuff. You know, we get death metal takes like a crazy turn, where we're getting these female fronted fucking power screamer, you know, vocalists, and we're getting like metalcore, which then leads to mathcore, and there's an explosion of like gothic metal, folk metal, fantasy metal. Like all of this stuff starts coming up thanks to like everything that came before. They're just like, let me take pieces of it and put it together in like new and interesting ways.
Yeah, I would have to say that, like, especially for a lot of that fantasy metal and like kind of the shit that got popular in the 2000s, like Children of Bodom and stuff, like none of that would have existed without like the black metal, you know, surge that came out of like Scandinavia, and that whole culture, I think, definitely lended a hand to like what was going to become those really screamy kind of bands. That I feel like, yeah, metal took so many different like routes through the 90s that like by the time we got to the 2000s, like there were so many variations and like subgenres of metal that were nowhere near the mainstream, and then what was in the mainstream fucking sucked.
Yeah,
like
agreed.
Yeah. Like if I think of like what was popular in like early 2000s metal, like I think about like Lamb of God, I guess, which a lot of people really like. No, thank you, but you know, that's their thing.
Tough Guy hardcore.
Yeah. Then, oh god, you got bands like fucking Hatebreed and shit that came out that is like, oh no. They're so bad. I do want to backtrack a little bit just to like the mid to late 90s too, and just I want to bring up the stoner metal scene though, because
yeah,
it is unfair for me to say that was the worst like era for metal, because the stoner metal that came out of the 90s was excellent. You had, you know, the rise of bands like Mastodon in like the late 90s.
Queens of the Stone Age is considered a stoner metal band, which I don't agree with necessarily, but fine.
I would agree with that. I would maybe call them desert rock, because, you know, that's kind of what they are. But like Caius was definitely like some stoner metal shit, and that's what Queens of the Stone Age was born out of. So I could see how they like attached to that scene.
Mm-hmm.
I love Queens of the Stone Age. I'm a big fan, especially their early stuff. But like, I really do like Caius a lot, and I would definitely say that was stoner metal, and that was really good stoner metal in the 90s as well. I guess like we have to talk about Sleep in the 90s too, if you're going to talk about stoner metal, because like they wrote an entire album that was one song. That's the most stoner metal thing I've ever heard. Also, like fantasy metal, if you're going to talk about fantasy metal and stoner metal, Sleep is like the apex of that.
Yeah, I forgot that. So there's a couple of bands that released really epic albums in that time, but they were like also underground. Like Queens of the Stone Age did Queensryche did Operation Mindcrime, which is like a concept album. And then Nevermore also released a concept, I believe it was a concept album. And both of those are just amazing, epic pieces that are overlooked outside of like their metal genre communities, but they're really impressive feats. Like Sentient Number 6 is one of like the best songs I feel like ever.
Right on.
It takes you on a journey.
Throw that in the show notes for anybody who wants to hear that.
I know we're gonna have to talk about our favorite bands as we like wrap up, you know, whenever we get out of the 90s.
Yeah, I know, the 90s. So much happened in the 90s, and I feel like it's because like music, like the music industry was having a moment, you know. They had blown up so big, and there was so much technology for recording at that point, because like we had come out of like, I don't know, it was 30 years past like the 60s, you know, so like everything had progressed, and then like CDs were a thing, so music was, you know, readily available, and you didn't have to have a fucking record player to listen to it. You had like Walkmans and shit, you know. So I think
you also didn't have to record in just analog anymore. I feel like that started in the 90s. You could do multi-track recording easily and like processing and stuff.
Yeah, I feel like the music industry was just really having a moment, because like at that point, like albums were still how you got music, and digital music didn't really exist yet, so that there was just so much life and so much like money being pumped into that industry. So I feel like that's why there was such a boom for different record labels, different genres, all of those things in the 90s. But yeah, so anyway, stoner metal I think is crucial to talk about if you're going to talk about like what would become like modern day punk rock in terms of like I would really argue that bands like Kylesa from the stoner metal, like Georgia stoner metal scene, definitely started crossing the lines back into being punk rock, but like also very much being like a stoner metal band, So I think like they're important to mention for that, because now there's so many bands that are like that like you could consider either or. Yeah. And I think like the 2000s is where all of this like distinction dies, and like scenes really start to meld together into one thing, because music became digital and it became accessible. And so you weren't just shopping for CDs in one genre or like going to shows and getting like one kind of artist anymore. Suddenly like music is getting eclectic, Yeah. And that was probably just the birth of the digital age of music that did that. And like I saw Tragedy play a few years ago in LA, and they played with Author and Punisher, who, if you're not aware of that band, it's not really a band, it's one dude, and he definitely makes industrial music, but he's also an engineer, so he like built a machine basically to be a one-man industrial band. Or like a series of machines. He's fucking incredible. If you're ever bored, look up Author and Punisher. He's just insane to watch. But like that was a weird combination of artists at a show, Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was kind of the result of like the birth of the digital age, and just like having like this kind of like algorithmic thought process on music now, because that's what music is now. It's like, oh, you like this metal band, maybe you like this punk band,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I just to note on digital music, Spotify used to automatically shuffle all of their songs when you like logged into an album or anything, or you went to stream an album. And they turned off automatic shuffle. I'm not sure if Adele sued them or what exactly happened, but it became policy then to turn off shuffle, because, most people consume music digitally on a streaming service, and an album is meant to be heard in a specific order for a certain like meaning, or, there's a reason that the tracks are in the order that they are. So sure. You now have to turn off or turn on shuffle if you don't want to hear it in order, which that I think sense. Yeah, it's amazing. Like, because when you would just get a CD, you would pop it in and play it start to finish. And like, I got really kind of like disjointed, I guess. I don't know. I had a disorienting moment the first time I played like a familiar album on Spotify, and I was like, this is not how this is supposed to go. And then I had to manually turn off shuffle. It's very weird.
Yeah, that is really weird. It's kind of fucking with somebody's art, like, especially like if somebody's making a concept album, then like that's very particular. Like
the concept is dead.
Yeah, I mean, if you're just going to jumble it around, that's really not how that art is supposed to be interpreted, not, via the artist's vision. So that's shitty of them. Anyway, so then, yeah, I would say like the early 2000s kind of had a real shit show for both punk and metal, with pop punk being really popular. And then like metal took like a really weird, also like toothless fucking turn in the early 2000s with bands like Disturbed and Slipknot and all this really shitty watered down metal music, or like I don't know, metal got so weird in the 2000s.
It got showy, like the same thing. So pop punk is the show, and metal also got showy. I didn't listen to any of those metal bands. I was firmly rooted in trance at the time, in the early 2000s, and then I was trying to rekindle like my appreciation for things I knew before. So I didn't hear a whole bunch of whatever was going on with the commercialization of metal, aside from what was on the radio, until like I met the Mister. Some good things did come out of that era. Like, I think we get the formation of like Killswitch Engage. I think at least, well, Killswitch Engage definitely, I feel like, put out their first album in the mid 2000s. So they were around at least. And Atreyu, and then Under Oath and Dragon Force. I think you're getting an emergence of like, Lacuna Coil, and like their take on gothic metal is just really cool. At least the early stuff. They also took a weird commercialized turn in like the 2010s ish after Comalize, but
yeah. I mean, I think like Atreyu and like Under Oath and like those kinds of bands were like essentially the metal equivalent of like what pop punk was when it like started taking that dive into like emo. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
I would call Atreyu a screamo band, I think.
Me too.
I mean, yeah, and like Under Oath as well, like it got really like sensitive boy sad time, which is such a huge contrast to what it was like in the 90s,
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with having feelings, but like I could not say that like I want to hear somebody scream at me about how sad they are. Like that seems self-indulgent,
I literally found them by going into our newly opened Hot Topic in Hilo at the time and being like, what are the kids listening to? And those are what those were the recommendations.
Yeah, also like I'm pretty sure like Under Oath is super, super Christian.
They are.
Yeah, that whole like era gave birth to like a fucking whole bunch of shitty Christian metal bands. It's like, okay, it's one thing that you're like screaming at me about being like sad or whatever, but like it's a whole nother thing that you're screaming at me about Jesus. Like, shut up. No, thank you. Stop it. Like, why is this so aggressive? Like, it was just a weird way to take metal. And I mean, yeah, there's definitely like Christian punk bands too. I've never
MXPX.
They're a pop punk band. I wouldn't call them really like punk rock. Like not the way that like it's not like they're like a Black Flag-esque kind of like da 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 like punk rock, but like also screaming at you about Jesus. I'm sure those exist. I've never tried to find them, but like I definitely wouldn't want to hear that either. It sounds fucking terrible. I will say one really good thing that came out of the 2000s though was like math metal.
Mathcore is so good.
Like Between the Buried and Me, like their first album Colors was exceptional. And that's, when you talk about like a concept album that's meant to be heard in, the correct order from start to finish, like that album's a masterpiece because of that. And I'll fuck with some math metal. It's very impressive, especially like when those metal musicians like Between the Buried and Me just came out of like music school. So like they don't only play metal, but they're like throwing in like jazz breakdowns and like, crazy stuff like that. That's always really cool.
Yeah. The very first one that I heard was I Wrestled a Bear Once. And I was like, this is just an amazing ride. Like whatever is happening, I'm down for it.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever really like dove too deep into math metal because like I appreciate it, but I'm not ever really trying to like seek it out.
Well, there's one band we both like in common that is mathcore, and it's Protest the Hero. They are so amazing.
Yeah, I'll fuck with Protest the Hero. More than anything with them, like musically, like their album Fortress was done so well musically. His voice can get kind of obnoxious, I think, but more than anything, their lyrical ability is just insane. Like it's some of the best writing I've ever heard a band do, and like not only like the best, but like the most explanatory. I think really after like the double digits, like 2010 and up, you're kind of looking at like everybody's downloading music at this point. Spotify has become a thing, you know, just like basic music streaming services have become a thing. And so, or Pandora, I guess, was like one that in the beginning you didn't really have a choice. They were just radio stations. And so like if you plugged in like a band, you were going to hear a bunch of bands that you didn't necessarily want to hear, but like also find new music. And I think that's when like music really started becoming like this big eclectic thing that it is now. And I don't know, like it's so hard to like say that anybody's into any one genre anymore because of that, you know?
I agree. In the 2010s, also, we get a lot of people that are starting to not only be found on YouTube, but get YouTube famous, and where they can just sustain. So like Polyphia right now is a progressive band. They're like prog rock, but I would actually argue, they're prog rock, but they got so famous on YouTube that, you know, they got signed. This is like such a familiar story now. Being YouTube famous is like a thing in its own right. Tosin Abasi from Animals as Leaders, who just got named earlier this year guitarist of the decade.
I would fucking agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so Animals as Leaders started there. They actually were really foundational in gent, I believe, as well as like advancing progressive metal, like in a way that we haven't really conceptualized since like the 90s with like Dream Theater. And then before that, like the 60s, like prog metal goes like these huge stretches of time before there's anything, I feel like, that happens monumentally like in the genre.
Yeah, I think it's because it's one of those genres like doom metal where like it's definitely difficult to listen to if you're not trying to fuck with that too much, you know? Like
I know I'd love to hear some good, what you consider good doom bands, because, you know, maybe that's a thing.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of them. I mean, a lot of them kind of take like that. There's like some southern like kind of influence to them. Like I would say Graveyard has like a really southern bluesy influence to them. Witchcraft is pretty good. I mean, there's definitely some good ones out there. I'll make you a playlist. But yeah, I would kind of on like the prog rock side of things, I would kind of say that Pink Floyd could be considered a prog rock band, you know, and I know that like they have a lot of fans and then they have a lot of haters because they're, you know, they're hard to listen to sometimes. But I think like that's kind of like prog in itself is just it's a lot, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah,
I was going to say, I do have to say that a lot of like my metal education, aside from what I actually experienced, you know, didn't really come until I met my mister, but we kind of discovered bands at the same time too. So like he, you know, showed me really cool stuff that I wasn't aware of, like Nevermore and Protest the Hero. But like we also, you know, are in this journey of metal like together too in some ways. I don't know. I just felt like, you know, I'm repping Nevermore like I'm their biggest fan or something, but like I just want the world to know about them because they are amazing, but I didn't find them. And as you'll find with music, like it's really rare to like discover something all on your own.
I feel like I met my partner because he was in a death metal band and all the bands in Hawaii played with each other because this island is very small, which is like, you know, how we met. But like, I feel like we definitely bonded over like mutual taste, and that mutual taste was not in punk bands.
Same. Yeah. I had to really help him articulate a punk palette or something. I don't know. Yeah. He has an appreciation for it now.
Yeah. I mean, like, I feel like I definitely was able to win more favor with crust punk than anything else, but like it definitely, like, he had like conceptually no understanding of punk rock when I met him. He just thought it was all like, you know, fucking, I don't know, Green Day or whatever, you know. And I mean, like, there's a lot of things that he listens to that, like, I'm not going to listen to. Like, I'm not going to fucking listen to Cannibal Corpse. You know what I mean? Like, but then we have a lot of stuff in common as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, good stuff. If there is any one band or genre that you would like listeners to listen to from metal or punk today, what would it be?
On the metal side of things, I'm going to say High on Fire. That is like Sleep in the 90s, reformed as, well, I shouldn't say reformed because they technically are still in existence as well, but members from Sleep formed High on Fire in the late 90s. And if I'm going to describe them as anything, and some people disagree with me on this, but like stylistically and like musically, like they're kind of just like really heavy Motorhead, which is the thing that I like about them because I fucking love Motorhead, but like they're really, I have yet to hear a bad album from them. Nice. I think right now they're 8 albums deep, and yeah, Matt Pike is just just a beast of a little man, and he makes good music, and I really like High on Fire a lot on the metal side of things. And then on the punk rock side of things, that is hard. I guess I'm gonna say listen to anything by Crue. Like anything. If you're gonna look them up, obviously their name is Crue, so you might want to write Crue punk, or anything by Crue is gonna be fucking excellent, and I highly recommend them. What about you?
Honestly, the first thing that came up, and it was a surprise to me that it even came up, is Arch Enemy, which is a female-fronted melodic death metal band. And their stuff with Angela Gossard is like the stuff that I prefer. They have a new singer. I recommend just checking them out to see what women in metal like are doing. And it's a female fronted metal band. I like them a lot. And then, for punk, I wasn't really prepared to like talk about it, I guess, today. I mean, my favorite band is Strung Out. And so they have been a band for over 30 years. They have 16 albums in their discography, including one fully acoustic album. And then they've participated in like concept projects like the T4 Project, which is a concept album about AIDS, the AIDS crisis. And it's really cool. I guess I'll go with the T4 Project then, which the lead singer of the T4 Project is Jason Cruz, the lead singer of my favorite band. Yeah, so that took me by surprise. We're going with that, the T4 Project.
Cool, right on. Cool. Well, that was quite a discussion. I mean, it's only like the tip of the iceberg too, because that's such an insane topic. To cover, and it's so wide, but
it is. It's super wide. I'm really proud of us for doing this, and that it turned out kind of how it did. And are there any shout outs that you have for today?
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of thinking about right now. I haven't really been looking around at organizations, and I guess we kind of did some band shout outs right there. So
yeah. I'm gonna shout out an alumni from my high school, which is the Las Vegas Academy of International Studies Performing and Visual Arts. Now it's just called Las Vegas Academy of the Arts. One of the people that went to my school, his name is Tyler Merritt. He made a video called Before You Call the Cops. It went viral on social media. And the point of the video is the more you know someone, the more empathy, understanding, and compassion that you have. And I think it came out, or at least it went viral in 2020 when all that shit was going down. And out of that came this book called I Take My Coffee Black, which shares stories from his own experiences as a 6'2", really intimidating looking Black man in America. He has dreads, wow. He's tall, but he's he's really nice. And he also, I guess the book is very religious too. So, it has religion in it. Jesus is incorporated into his life, and then musical theater, and it's just a journey. It's a journey. And we're all really proud of him for this book. It's been out for a while, and and I wanted to share that.
Awesome, dude. That's really cool. Shout out to that dude. Congratulations. And yeah, I guess that wraps it up for this week.
Yay, we did it.
All right. Well, we're Out on an Island Podcast. You can find us at our website, outOnAnIslandPodcast.com.
On Instagram at Out on an Island Podcast.
And pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Oh, yeah. And then email us at outonanislandpodcast@gmail.com.
Yeah. This past week, for any of our regular listeners, we kind of ran this little question to open up the discussion of like where you stand on art and artists and the controversy that surrounds it. And I think we're going to start doing that more regularly. And thank you for everybody who's participating, because we love it when you do.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll see you next time.
All right. Good night, everybody.